Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. Um, just a reminder, you are working your way through deliverable 7, and we'll have a hands up this morning. Hands up if you have a KNN that's recognizing at least two numbers better than 50%. KNN that's recognizing at least 3 digits better than 50%. 4 digits better than 50%. 5 digits better than 50%. 6 digits better than 50%. 7 digits better than 50%. 8 digits better than 50%. 9 digits better than 50%. 10 digits better than 50%. Okay. Amanda is there, and the rest of you are working on it. You've got a couple days left. Damien's there. You got a couple days left to work on this. Just a reminder: today I have my office hours, which are usually 11 to noon. I had to move them today to 2 to 3. So if you're still struggling with your KNN and you don't know what to try next, please be sure to try and come and see me or Amanda during our office hours for help. Okay, so any questions about deliverable 7? Quick questions. Otherwise, come see us during office hours. No? Okay. All right, so we are going to finish our section on cognitive psychology today, where we've swept through just a few aspects of human cognition, and we're going to spend most of today, talking about the role of affect or emotion in human-computer interaction, and we will probably start in today on crowdsourcing. We'll see how we go. Okay, we ended last time by visiting with an old friend, Hal, who in the short span of about 30 seconds seems to express a wide range of emotion, anger, jealousy, regret, contrition, and so on. For most of us, we're pretty convinced that Hal may be able to express these emotions, but probably doesn't have them. So we're going to obviously distinguish today, when we're talking about emotions in machines, between the outward expression of emotions and the internal subjective feeling of emotion. Okay. We ended last time by talking about this concept of anthropomorphization, which is the attribution of human behaviors or properties to non-human animals, or in our case, machines. In the information age these days, we do this all the time. Here's a random email I got from UVM years ago. Something was wrong with the software. When the software was feeling better, they would send out all the delayed reports, right? We do this all the time, even though we know that the software itself is not feeling ill. Okay. This aspect of anthropomorphization is going to come up 3 times today. It's going to come up in 3 different branches of affective computing. So affective computing itself is a branch of human-computer interaction. And inside affective computing, researchers are often trying to create interactive systems that recognize emotions in their human users. Or the flip side of that, enabling the interactive system itself to give the impression of having an emotion, giving an outward expression of an emotion, like we saw Hal doing last time. And then finally, assuming that we can get our interactive system to recognize the emotion of our human user, how do we modulate or modify the behavior of the software to make sure that we're evoking positive human emotions rather than causing negative human emotions like frustration and anger? Okay, so we'll look at each of these in turn today. We'll start with getting computers to recognize emotion. In the reading for today, there's kind of an amusing statistic, which is that 3/4 of people have admitted to swearing at their computers. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely in that camp. Why would we want to enable technologies to recognize emotion? Well, obviously, whatever it is that the system is causing, whatever the system is doing to cause the user to swear, it should probably not be doing that anymore. So there's a pretty obvious reason why we might want to recognize emotions in human users. But if we do want our technology to recognize emotion, how should we go about getting it to do so? We can create adaptive interfaces that recognize and modulate their behavior and emotion. And of course, first they have to recognize it. If they do, what are the ways in which they might be able to adapt? You can probably write down some ideas of your own. If the user is expressing anger or frustration, then the system should sort of tone down whatever it's doing, become more passive, and let the user assume more control over the direction the system is going. Most people become angry or frustrated with their system because they've lost control, or they have minimal control. You get the spinning wheel of death, and you can't reset, restart, slow down, speed up, change direction in the system. We might want to, in the opposite case, provide more information if the person seems curious or interested in what's going on at a given point in time in an interaction with the system. If the user is confused, provide less information. And especially if the system is able to elicit a positive emotion, to remember what elicited that positive emotion and be able to come back to that particular mode or function again. Okay, so if we're going to get computers to recognize emotion, well, what are they? That's obviously a big question, and again, could probably be an entire psychology course in and of itself. So for our purposes, we're going to focus on obviously the outward expression of emotion. Our interactive systems at the moment do not have access to our internal emotional state. That might change in the as brain-computer interactive devices become more widespread. BCI, which we'll talk about when we talk about cyborgs towards the end of the course. But for the moment, we're assuming that most technologies are not under the skin. They are on the skin or at a distance from the user, and they're going to have to try and recognize emotions from a distance. Humans have to do this with other humans as well. Most of our society relies on our ability to recognize the emotional state in others and adapt our behavior accordingly. So there was a very profound study back in the early 1970s by Ekman and Ellsworth, and what they found, or what they claimed to find, and this study is somewhat controversial, is that by studying the facial expression of large numbers of humans across very diverse cultures, they found that there were few cultural differences in the way in which expressions were expressed on the face. So in most cultures, when someone is feeling happy, they smile, and when they feel sad, they frown. The magnitude of the smile and frown may be slightly different depending on your culture, but generally speaking, Ekman and Ellsworth found that there were few cultural differences in the way emotions are expressed. For most aspects of human behavior, if there are little cultural differences that suggest the root or the cause of that behavior is much older than culture, or at least much older than the currently existing cultures, and might therefore be an evolutionary response. And there is a whole literature on what are the Darwinian pressures, or what are the evolutionary pressures acting on the expression of emotions. Why did we evolve to express emotions through facial expressions? We're not going to touch on that today. But from an HCI point of view, this is a promising result, because it means we can hopefully try and recognize or infer emotions from facial expressions regardless of the cultural background of our human user. The other good news here is that facial expressions can lead to the quantification of emotion. What Ekman and Ellsworth actually found was that certain face muscles are tensed during the expression of certain facial expressions, which correspond to certain emotions. 8 years later, Plutchik put together an emotion wheel, which is he used similarities in the subset of muscle groups in the face that were being tensed to arrange related emotions. So sadness and disgust are closer to one another on the emotion wheel than sadness and joy are. Most of us would intuitively expect that sadness and joy are further from one another than sadness and disgust, but we might be hard-pressed to explain quantitatively why that's the case. In this case, the emotion wheel uses this distance of overlap in the subset of muscle groups that are being tensed during these facial expressions. So to illustrate this, I took halves of faces from the internet and put them together for these various facial expressions. So this is sort of my own attempt at an optical illusion here. Your brain obviously knows, your prefrontal cortex, the logical part of your brain, immediately recognizes that this is not the same face, this is not an individual person, but hopefully the other parts of your brain can recognize particular facial expressions and what those facial expressions are communicating. So what are some of the common features between neighboring facial expressions here? Obviously, we can't see the muscle groups directly in these images or when we're looking at another human being, but we can infer it from the deformations of the skin of the face. What are some of these common features? What are shared by neighboring wedges in the circle, between certain wedges in the circle that are not present in the other wedges of the circle? If you have an idea, go ahead and type it into chat. Similar mouth groups, right? So you can see between disgust and sadness, we have a frown, a downward pulling set of lips. In anticipation and joy, we have an upwardly curving lips. What are some other features? As you remember from, or as you'll now know through your use of KNN, we need as many features as possible. The more features we have, the better chance a machine learning algorithm is going to do at recognizing whether a current face is expressing sadness, surprise, joy, and so on. Eyebrows. So Con, what is it about eyebrows that are similar between neighboring wedges and different compared to other wedges? So raised eyebrows, yeah, exactly. So raised eyebrows shows up not just in the case of anger, anticipation as well, or surprise. When humans are engaged in social interaction, most of the time we are looking into the eyes of the interlocutor, the other person that we're speaking with. The eyes communicate obviously a lot, or they advertise much about internal emotional state. What is similar about the eyes in these images and different about the eyes compared to distant wedges in the emotion wheel? The faces that I've constructed for the pair of wedges, joy and acceptance, these faces, at least to me, seem somewhat similar. What is the common feature between joy and acceptance? Or perhaps satisfaction is a better term here. relaxed eye muscles, right? So you can actually, if you think about it, you can actually pick out in these images which parts of the face are tensed and which parts of the face are relaxed. So the fact that we can visually interpret some of these features is promising. It suggests that we may be able to construct a machine learning algorithm that can similarly observe faces and infer emotional state from them. Okay, so how would we do this? Well, we would do this in the normal way that you set up your KNN, or the way you would normally set up a machine learning process. We have to start with our input data. What is our training data? We could, of course, actually instrument the face or the head of the human user. There are many other things other than just facial expression that correlate with internal emotional state. Your heart might race, the movement of your body may be different for different emotional states. Electromyograms, EMGs, which we talked about a couple lectures back, they measure the tensing of muscles directly. Can measure body movements, respiration rates, heart rate, skin conductance. A very important feature in a lie detector. Of course, these days, now with the improvements in machine learning, perhaps we don't actually need these. These are probably not going to be acceptable from the point of view of our users. Remember the Hci Non-Functional Requirements. One of them is that the user has to accept or be willing to use the system. If the system can only recognize emotions if you wear certain instrumentation on the face or head, that's probably not very acceptable. So we can probably do quite a bit with a webcam, just visual images of the face itself. Okay, once we have our input data, then our machine learning algorithm has to go looking for features, furrowed brows, smiles, furrowed brows, smiles and frowns, and so on. And then our system needs to reason about those features, needs to combine them in certain ways to make a prediction about what emotion is being expressed. So remembering in the case of your KNN, this reasoning part of the KNN is finding another face in the training set of faces that has a similar tensing of muscles, if we're focusing on facial expression, and returning the class label associated with that image, which in this case, a class label is going to be something like angry, happy, frustrated, satisfied, and so on. So there are obviously many different kinds of machine learning algorithms. So just for today's purposes, I've represented this as a decision tree. So assuming that our system can extract features from the raw pixels of an image of a face, it might detect teeth. If teeth are being shown, that corresponds to a subset of emotions. If teeth are detected and lips are curving upward, then possibly the system will predict that the face in the image is expressing joy. If teeth are detected and the brow is furrowed, maybe that's anger. Someone seems extremely upset, and so on. Okay, so we might start by creating a decision tree like this at random, putting different facial features into the conditionals here, and putting different predictions in the clauses themselves. And we might then measure for a given decision tree how good its predictions are. So imagine we have two stimuli, two separate images of two separate faces. We put the first image in and the system predicts joy, but the user was actually expressing anger, so -1 point for the decision tree. Second image, second face, we feed that into the decision tree. The decision tree predicts joy. That user indicates they actually were pleased, so +1 point. Given the fact that this decision tree got 1 out of 2 correct, that's not very good. So maybe we restructure the decision tree a little bit. This would be like learning or adding additional training data to your KNN, making some change to the machine learning the learner, and then hopefully it will do a better job at making predictions. Okay. All right, so again, you can imagine that this has come a long way. Obviously, we now have very good facial recognition on our phones and our technologies. Not only can we recognize the faces of who is in the image, but most machine learning algorithms these days that work on this problem can do a pretty good job of predicting at least the expression, at least the emotion that's being expressed on the face of the user in the image. Okay, so let's flip this around now and think about the converse problem in effective computing, which is trying to get machines to give the impression of having emotion. But this should immediately raise the question in your mind of not only can we enable technologies to do this, but why would we want to do this in the first place? One reason is a very interesting quirk of human psychology, which is that people tend to respond very strongly to objects that seem to express emotions, even if we're not sure whether the other that we're observing has those emotions. If you casually scroll through your favorite social media feed, I am sure you will see images of cute pets and cute animals where the owner writes in the post, my cat seems pretty displeased this morning. Now, whether the cat is actually displeased or not is a matter of debate, but most of us instinctually feel drawn to the image because of the fact that this animal seems to be expressing this emotion. This is often an act of anthropomorphization, right? We are attributing human emotions to animals, and in the case of interactive systems, we might also be willing or unable not to attribute human qualities to interactive systems. So what you're seeing in the image here, this is the Kismet Robot built at MIT a number of years ago. You can see that the construction of this robot was deliberately caricaturized various features of the face so that the facial features associated with certain emotions can be exaggerated by Kismet. I'll show you a short video, and in this clip you're going to hear Kismet repeat the same phrase over and over again and inflect that phrase with different facial expressions.
Do you really think so? 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 Do you really think so?
Okay, so there's Kismet repeating the phrase, "Do you really think so?" over and over again. Why does Kismet have ears? Most of us don't waggle our ears when we are trying to advertise our emotional state to an interlocutor. What was the purpose of adding ears to Kismet? So in this example, we've moved from human-computer interaction, HCI, to human-robot interaction, HRI. We are the creators of Kismet are trying to induce or create this feedback loop between Kismet and the observer. Henry says it expresses emotions similar to most animals which humans recognize. There's an interesting argument in animal studies, which is that cats and dogs, domesticated cats and dogs, evolved to become protected by humans, and the best way to do that was to elicit positive emotional response from humans. And dogs, at least, especially cats to some degree, use their ears to amplify their advertisement of emotional state, right? So Kismet is not just is really not a strict representation of a human here. It's some combination of human and animal, and like our domesticated pets, is trying to exaggerate emotional expression to really pull on our heartstrings, to really trigger this anthropomorphization response. Willem says we're familiar with animals like cats and dogs that do this as well. More total input to receive, right? More total input for us as human observers for the moment to receive, right? It is pretty clear what emotion Kismet is trying to communicate. In one of the clips, in one of the repetitions, Kismet was very sad. Do you really think so? How did Kismet advertise sadness?
Do you really think so?
Kismet hangs its head and its ears and its eyebrows, everything droops. Why? Humans do this to some degree when expressing a sad emotion. Why? Let's go back to dogs for a moment. Dogs especially exaggerate this particular notion. When dogs know that they've done something wrong, they will often advertise contrition or sadness and hang their head in their ears. Why do dogs do this? There's an important behavior in the canine species that's related here. Dogs are evolved from wolves. Wolves hunt and do pretty much everything as a pack. And for a pack to work well, there is a very clearly defined set of dominance relationships. And one way to signal sadness or contrition is to literally bow down before someone else or something else and exhibit sadness or contrition. Okay, so there are a lot of subtleties going on in the social advertisement of internal emotional state, and we can create machines that replicate those behaviors which humans tend to expect when they're interacting with other humans or other domesticated animals. Remember that throughout HCI we are trying to match and support humans' expectations that they're bringing from the physical or social world into the informational world. So this was a research project. Kismet was a research project carried out almost 20 years ago now at MIT. One of the graduate students working on that project, Cynthia Brazil, several years afterwards founded the Jibo Corporation. And the Jibo Corporation's attempt was to try and to take all of the mechanical complexity of Kismet and boil it down to the simplest possible device, something that is almost a cell phone, the simplest possible device that still is able to easily advertise a range of emotional states back to its human user. I'm going to play you the promotional video just before the Jibo launch, which was about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago now. Unfortunately, last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, the Jibo Corporation filed for bankruptcy. There was a competing Chinese company that produced a related product that was slightly cheaper. That's how things go. But anyways, I'll show you Jibo. And as you watch the promotional video, I want you to pay attention to the clever hardware and software and how they were exploited to try and communicate emotional state. What are the actual features that you can recognize in Jibo?
This is your house. This is your car. This is your toothbrush. These are your things. But these are the things that matter. And somewhere in between is this guy. Introducing Jibo, the world's first family robot. Say hi, Jibo.
Hi, Jibo.
Jibo helps everyone out throughout their day. He's the world's best cameraman. By intelligently tracking the action around him, he can independently take video and photos, so that you can put down your camera and be a part of the scene.
Jibo, take the picture.
He's a hands-free helper. You can talk to him, and he'll talk to you back, so you don't have to skip a beat.
Excuse me, Anne?
Yes, Jibo.
Melissa just sent a reminder that she's picking you up in half an hour to go grocery shopping.
Thanks, Jibo.
He's an entertainer and educator. Through interactive applications, Jibo can teach.
Let me in, or else I'll... And I'll blow your house in.
Hey, where'd you go? There you are.
He's the closest thing to a real-life teleportation device. He can turn and look at whoever you want with a simple tap of your finger.
Check out my turkey dinner, Mom.
I wish you wouldn't eat that.
Hey, baby turkey pizza? I want turkey pizza.
And he's a platform, so his skills keep expanding. He'll be able to connect to your home.
Welcome home, Eric.
Hey, buddy. Can you order some takeout for me?
Sure thing. Chinese, as usual?
You know me so well.
And even be a great wingman.
You have a voice message from Ashley. Want to hear it?
Absolutely.
Hey, call me when you're home.
Better make that takeout for two, Jibo.
You've dreamt of it for years, and now he's finally here. And he's not just an aluminum shell, nor is he just a 3-axis motor system. He's not even just a connected device. He's one of the family.
Good night, Jibo.
Jibo, this little bot of mine.
Okay, when I first showed the Jibo promotional video about 5 years ago, somebody asked if it was actually an advertisement for a Black Mirror episode. I don't know. Some people feel Jibo's a little bit more frightening than Hal.
This is your house.
What features?
This is your car.
What features does Jibo advertise to cast the illusion, or attempt to cast the illusion, that it has a particular emotion at a given point in time? Differing facial expressions and use of emojis. Yeah, so obviously Jibo was built for our decade, unlike Kismet. It's able to exhibit or advertise emotions in a wider range of ways. The circle changes color as emotions change, right? That's kind of interesting. What expectation is being supported by the change in color that's being drawn from people's expectations of social interaction? If you go back and watch this video, you'll notice that the circle meant to represent Jibo's face reddens when it's happy, or expressing the emotion of happiness. Why is redness associated with happiness? Abstractly, red is often associated with anger, but if we're talking specifically about facial expressions, face-to-face interaction, why is redness associated with happiness? There's a physiological connection here. Blushing, right? So blushing, perhaps if you're embarrassed, or you're blushing because you're, it's a mixture of embarrassment and happiness. When you are really happy and you laugh, that requires a lot of energy, and blood rushes to the face, right? So there's some very subtle physiological cues that are simplified and abstracted, but still present in Jibo. So the circle meant to represent Jibo's face changed color. It also changed shape. In what way? And what was it? Which particular aspect of social interaction was being supported by the deformation of the circle? or anything else you noticed in the video. If you watch it carefully, there's 10, 12, 14 different very simple movements or behaviors that Jibo generates that are mimicking various social exchanges between humans or between humans and domesticated animals. Okay, I'll leave you to think about that, and we'll move on. So, assuming that we want to do this, and we can enable technologies to do this, and we can elicit this aspect of anthropomorphization, how could that be useful for forwarding whatever it is that whatever activity the person wants to carry out with the interactive technology? By creating this anthropomorphic bond, we're trying to create an emotional bond, at least from the point of view of the human user. So in the somewhat cheesy video you just saw about Jibo, the idea was, or the hope was, that Jibo would be able to create an emotional bond between itself and members of the family. That would be particularly useful for interactions that are painful or difficult or can be boring at times, interactions that go on for quite a long period of time. And maybe this emotional bond or this anthropomorphic engagement will help to make that interaction a little bit more pleasant for the user. This is true in a lot of different kinds of educational software. So for any of you that have tried out Duolingo, which is a language teaching software, there's Duolingo's owl, this little mascot that sort of cheers you on as you go, right? So learning something can often be frustrating, boring, requires lots of repetition. If you have something that it seems to be engaged with you on an emotional level during this learning process, often the emotions being expressed by the system are sort of messages for, I know this is difficult for you, I feel your pain, I'm bored too, I'm frustrated too, let's just do one more exercise, and so on. There's also an application for these kinds of technologies in physiotherapy and therapeutic software. We're going to talk about robots in a couple of weeks. You'll see some examples of physiotherapy robots and therapeutic software where, at least on the point of view of the user, as they're rehabilitating, there may be some actual physical pain, and physical pain is obviously associated with extreme emotions, and it may be useful if there's a interactive technology involved that is actually asking you to carry out an action that's physically or emotionally painful, that the system itself is advertising that it recognizes your emotional state and it feels sorry that you have to go through this process. I know this is emotionally difficult, but it is also, these kinds of technologies are also seeing application in exposure therapy, which is used for therapy for anxiety and for PTSD. One of the very first applications of this was for veterans returning from the Gulf War. In this case, they were placed inside a simulated vehicle, a simulated Humvee, and they were looking through an empty plate glass window at an empty wall. Even sitting in a vehicle for a lot of returning war veterans, that was an extremely anxiety-inducing experience. They were, in this case, instrumented with electrodes that could measure heart rate and skin conductance. And the system would measure the emotional state, or at least the physical arousal of the patient sitting in the vehicle, and would do nothing. The system would just wait until they gradually acclimated to sitting in the simulated Humvee. As they did, the system would increase the virtual reality or the augmented reality of their experience by projecting an empty desert scene onto the quote-unquote windshield of the simulated Humvee, which for many patients would immediately cause anxiety to increase again. The system would wait until they acclimate to what they are seeing or what they're experiencing. As they do, the simulated vehicle would start to rock back and forth and provide the physical sensation that the vehicle was moving. So one of the challenges of exposure therapy is reaching just that limit that induces a little bit of anxiety, but not too much anxiety, just enough to allow the patient themselves to gain control over their experience and be able to calm themselves down and convince themselves that they are not in any clear and present danger. System like that, as you can imagine, is extremely emotionally fraught for the human user, and a calm interactive system that is demonstrating that it knows what the emotional state of the patient is and possibly expressing its own emotional state. It is also feeling what you are feeling, may be useful in such situations. Obviously, this has to be done very carefully, but there is an application for affective devices in such a domain. Okay, so last part here is obviously, in some cases, we would like to not just minimize negative affect, anxiety, fear, frustration, and so on, but maximize positive affect. So designing for pleasure, joy, satisfaction, and so on. Like many times before in this course, we're now dealing with something that is very subjective. What does it mean for the user to have a pleasurable experience with their interactive technology? That's a very joy or pleasure or satisfaction is a very vague subjective term. We're going to, as usual, try and unpack this into specific aspects of pleasure in this case, and ways we might be able to actually measure these things. Okay, as usual, we'll start with some of the more obvious aspects of pleasure, like physio pleasure. So this arises from the observation or the actual physical manipulation of an object. So Apple got this right at the beginning. They recognized that computers, certainly desktops back in those days, had to not just be functional, but beautiful. And people would be willing to pay more money for a beautiful and functional machine over just a functional machine. And clearly, if you look at the product line over the history of Apple, all of its devices take this idea of physio pleasure into account in some way. What are some other technologies, Apple or otherwise, that elicit physio pleasure? They're beautiful to look at, they're satisfying to manipulate or hold or plug together, snap together. Can you think of some other examples here? Right at the beginning of the course, we talked about ergonomics, which is how to design things that are beautiful or elicit this kind of physio pleasure from their users. So Mac trackpads, right? The size of a trackpad on a Mac has varied over the lifetime of that product line, and getting that size right, size itself, is an important feature of physio pleasure. Cell phones for a long period of time got smaller up until recently, and they got a little bit larger again. There's something about holding as simple as holding an object in your hand, that it takes quite a bit to get that right for that to be a pleasurable experience. What is the best size for a cell phone? Given the advancing technology now, we can probably pack quite a bit of functionality into an extremely small phone, but if it's too small, it's not exactly pleasurable or convenient to hold in your hand. Okay. Socio-pleasure, obviously having a great discussion with a friend or a challenging argument that you win at the end. There is clearly much pleasure that humans derive from social interaction, and we can all feel the inverse of that during the pandemic era, right? Lots of our social exchanges, like in-person social exchanges, have gone away, and most of us are feeling the adverse emotional impact of that. Most computer technologies, or a lot of computer technologies, have been designed to try and facilitate social exchange or create new forms of social exchange. Whether that's actually improved your social relationships with friends and families or allowed you to build a bigger social network than you had before, hard to say. Okay, I think that one is obvious, right? All social network apps are examples of trying to maximize socio pleasure. Psychopleasure, this one is a little bit more elusive, a little bit more difficult to measure whether it's working or not, which is the cognitive and or emotional satisfaction you derive from achieving something that was challenging. So learning a new programming language, learning math, learning a new language, learning to get things done more efficiently. There is a pleasure that you can derive when you overcome those, but in the process of learning a new programming language or a new natural language, it can be extremely frustrating, boring at times. So this one is very difficult for an interactive system to track because the vast majority of the process, the human user, is likely expressing furrowed brows and negative emotions, swearing at the computer, and so on. So how do you know, how would an interactive system know throughout that process whether those negative emotions are actually useful? They are bringing the user closer to their goal, which is learning the language, getting things done more efficiently, and so on. So think about perhaps your ASL educational game that you're working with, or Duolingo if you've ever used it, or any other educational software or tutorials. Imagine that you were to connect a webcam to that educational technology, and it's inferring the facial expressions of the user over time. Most of those frames of data are going to register negative human emotional state on the face. What might it be looking for in that data to indicate that at least the user is making progress? We're on that we, the interactive system, and the human user are on the right track. Are they frustrated because they're trying to learn a particular concept in the language, or are they frustrated because the system just isn't working? They're not making any progress on learning what they want to learn. It's a very tricky set of emotional states to distinguish between. How might you go about doing that? If you have an idea, go ahead and type it into chat. Imagine you're watching someone who is trying to learn a language. They're learning it by using an interactive technology or a textbook, doesn't really matter. What is happening? What is flitting over the face of a student as they are attempting to learn something that's difficult? What hints might you get along the way that despite the fact that it's mostly frustrating and boring, they're making progress. They are deriving psychopleasure from the process. What do you do as you're working your way through several hours of homework, but intermittently feeling excited that you've learned something, that you've made progress, that you've moved on to the next lesson? No? Let's go back to the emotion wheel for a moment. Most people they're learning something that are difficult. They're frustrated and they're bored, but suddenly they make progress, and there may be a very brief flash of joy or happiness. There's often a lot of anticipation. I wonder what's going to happen next. I'm making progress. What's coming next? I got past this difficult part. There may be certain things you can look for. There are behaviors beyond the face, right? The fist pump of, I finally figured that out. In the case of your ASL educational game, you could imagine that your system is active and periodically queries the user to see how they're doing. How might the user very quickly indicate to your ASL educational game that they're doing well, they're enjoying what's happening, they're making progress, it's okay, keep going? So as Khan says, in programming, when you finally get something to compile and run successfully, that's great, absolutely. That's easy enough for the system to detect because it's happening within the computer. What is happening on the face? What is happening on the user's face the moment the compiler reports 0 errors, that flash of a millisecond? The system might focus on exactly that moment. The system knows at what moment in time your code compiled correctly. And at that moment, it may take a photograph of the face and see something like acceptance or relief, as Julian says. Absolutely, right? As a coder, I know sometimes the best psychopleasure is exactly at that moment when some buggy code finally works, right? So the system can make use of context, in this case, the context surrounding coding, to focus in on particular points in time where there's going to be a very informative signal. If the system finally compiles and the user is still frustrated or bored, that's usually a good signal that they have to do this. There's homework that they have. Their homework is an hour late. It doesn't matter anymore. I just need to push through this. I'm no longer deriving psychopleasure from this process. It's just something I have to get done. There are these very subtle emotional cues that can be very useful from the point of view of the interactive system about how to alter the interaction to support the activity of the user. The activity might be, I just want to learn this for fun. I'm enjoying what's happening, or I have to learn this, I have no choice. Those are very different activities. Okay, as usual, we move on to the last aspect of this aspect of human behavior, which is ideological pleasure, much more difficult to measure, which is pleasure derived from doing things or achieving things in a way that conforms to our core values. So in HCI, this is often a user choosing to use open source software rather than commercial or closed software, using green technologies, running machine learning algorithms that have a smaller carbon footprint than other machine learning algorithms. This might not be something that the interactive system can detect directly. It may simply be a choice made by the user. They choose to use this system over another system. But if you're working for a company that's developing interactive systems, that's an important aspect of your human your demographic, your user base to keep in mind. Okay, that concludes our discussion on affective computing, and it also concludes our section on cognitive psychology. As promised, this was very short. We left a lot of aspects of human behavior that are relevant to HCI untouched. We're going to switch gears again now and enter into the longest segment of this course, which I've nicknamed Looking Outward. So in the majority of the history of computer interaction, it was one desktop, one human, no internet, just one-on-one between one computer and one human. But of course, one of the most exciting things about computer science and in our society in general, which is that over the last 10, 15 years, we have been developing generations of technology which are moving out into the world. And this outward movement takes many different forms, and we're going to look at those different forms in the lectures in this sequence. Okay, we're going to start today with looking at a particular way that technology has moved outward, which is that a technology is now not interacting with just one user, it is interacting simultaneously with many users. Or, from the point of view of the human user, they are working alongside many other humans and collectively contributing to a collective task. The activity here is some collective activity that would be beyond the ability of any one human user. So that human is going to want to participate in a team and use software that supports that team and makes it easier for the team as a whole to solve that problem, and that's crowdsourcing. Okay. So we're going to do this lecture chronologically, starting in 1999. Did anyone ever work with SETI at home? It's still going, I think. No, maybe a little bit too old for most people in the room here. So SETI at home, SETI is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. The SETI organization got access to a number of radio telescopes here in the US, and drew in back in the late 90s so much data that there was no way that the computers that SETI had available to them was going to be able to crunch through that radio telescope data looking for regular patterns. So as the name of SETI implies, they're looking for little green men out there in the universe, and they're going to do so, or they still are doing so, by looking at the background radiation of the universe and trying to pick out regular patterns that are probably not natural. They would have to be made by an external intelligence. So the people at SETI came up with this idea, which is, at least in the late 1990s, most people had desktops. And for a lot of the time, those desktops were unattended. People were doing other things, and the computer would flash up while the computer was not being used, a screensaver. So they figured they could exploit all of that unused computation to distribute the task of looking for artificial signals in radio data to those computers. The screensaver had these very engaging graphics. They were meant to communicate to the user, you're doing something very complicated, something very, very difficult to understand, but if we're lucky, we'll actually find alien intelligence out there in the universe. This was clearly pulling on people's pleasure, right? People's ideology, which is, some of us have a burning need to know whether we are alone in the universe. And SETI at home, for the very first time, made it possible for people to directly participate in that adventure. So if you ran SETI at home, you felt as if you were an active participant in this process, but unfortunately it was an illusion. You, the human user, were not actively involved. Your computer was. So SETI at home was exploiting distributed computation, but not distributed cognition. They weren't using the brains of their human users, they were just using the CPUs of their computers. Regardless, it was extremely successful. They recruited a huge user base. Again, as I said, I think this is still ongoing today. A year later, Berkeley, some researchers at Berkeley realized that you could use this idea not just for looking for little green men, but you could subjugate this technology to support other scientific endeavors, like the protein folding problem. So the protein folding problem, if you've ever taken a bio class, as you know, is that you put together a series of molecules in a one-dimensional chain, creating a protein, and depending on the nucleotides in that chain will fold up into a particular three-dimensional shape, and the three-dimensional shape of a protein dictates its behavior, what it does. It turns out, however, that the problem of predicting the 3D shape from the sequence of peptides on the protein chain is known. It can be done, but it's extremely computationally intensive to predict it because the computer has to simulate the folding process itself. So the Berkeley team created Folding at Home, which would allow, as a screensaver, your computer to fold various proteins. This has been extremely successful project. It's been ongoing for 20 years. There's been almost 140 research papers that have come out of Folding at Home. Folding at Home today is now being used to fold proteins, and I think it was last week or it was early this week that the Berkeley team announced they found a protein that folds and partially suffocates COVID. So The Berkeley team generalized this technology to the Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Network Computing, or BOINC, the BOINC system, which allows other researchers working on things other than protein folding to encapsulate their research program and embed it into BOINC, and then a user who downloads BOINC basically can select from a menu of different research projects which ones they would like their computer to work on. So in this example here, I don't know what W, can usually guess what these are. Washington University, I don't know what that is. Prime grid, so computing prime numbers. For those that have a mathematical inclination, you might derive some ideological pleasure from contributing to the search for ever larger prime numbers, or helping to try and prove the Collatz conjecture. Someone has their mic unmuted. Does somebody have a question or comment?
Yes. That's like a 30-minute what? There's not a proof of sack water bed pilot.
I'm sorry, it's hard to hear you. Could you repeat your question?
Just, you're not in a position to be picking and choosing your friends right now. How come the raccoons on like...
I'm not sure if that was a question directed at me. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, let's talk about the Esp Game, which was released to the net in 2004. This was a combination of gamification and crowdsourcing. Just give me one moment here. I think somebody's mic is unmuted. No? Okay. Sorry, this was a combination of gamification and crowdsourcing. And the game here was two users were randomly matched up on the internet. And they were both shown the same image, such as this landscape that you see here. They were given a number of taboo words they weren't allowed to type in. But then they were asked to type in with single words, what do you see in the image? And the game was not just to type in words that you see in the image, but to type in words that you think the other person will type in when they see this image. So in this cartoon example here, the pair of users both typed in the word tree, and so there was a match on the word tree. They got that correct. They were shown a second image and asked to type in words that described what they saw in the image, and so on. Why was the Esp game created? What was it designed to do? Why ask a very large number of users to describe a large number of photographs? Absolutely. So this was the very first attempt to try and create labeled image data set for the emerging deep learning, machine learning algorithms. So machine learning back in the early 2000s, it was becoming clear that machine learning algorithms could work, but it was hard to tell which machine learning algorithms were better than others because they simply didn't have enough data. So a group from Carnegie Mellon sat down to figure out how do we create a data set with 1 million or more images in them, and for which there are words associated with the images. So now, if we feed an image into a computer and a computer spits out a word, the computer's prediction about objects in that scene, how do we know whether that prediction is correct or not? We have to have words associated with those images from humans. That's what the Esp game was designed to do. David says, now we just do the same thing to prove to our computers that we are not robots. That's true. The person that created the Esp game also created CAPTCHAs. That's true. Okay. So part of the machine learning revolution owes its thanks to crowdsourcing and gamification. We just talked about the folding team at Berkeley. What was noticed back in when this was launched in the early 2000s is that the Berkeley research team started to get emails from frustrated users who said they were watching the screensaver and they were watching how the computer was trying to fold this string of beads. And the users claimed in the email that they could do a better job than the computers. They could see where the computers were making mistakes or having a hard time figuring out how to actually fold this thing into a compact shape. And they claimed that they could do better. The Berkeley team got a few emails like that, then hundreds of emails like that, then thousands of emails like that, and realized maybe it would be worthwhile actually testing the question, test the hypothesis of whether non-experts, these are not biochemists, just random people on the web, could actually do a good job of protein folding. So they created the game called Fold It, which again I think you can download and still play today, where basically you're shown a beginner puzzle, a relatively simple, short polypeptide chain, and you're asked to fold it into a compact shape. You can wiggle things, which represents Brownian motion, to allow the system to lock into a slightly more compact configuration, and so on. The Berkeley team solved some of these folding problems already and put them on there as solved problems. And if you also solved those problems, you got points and you moved on to the next one and so on until you got to sufficiently complex proteins in which it was not known what the 3D shape or the conformation of that protein was. But if there were many people on Fold It that came up with the same solution, the chance that that would happen by chance is extremely unlikely. So you could actually look at the crowd itself and take the consensus to determine that that is the correct fold for that protein. They could then take the supercomputers operating at Berkeley and actually fold that protein and see whether the computer did any better than humans. And it turns out that at least collectively, large numbers of non-experts can do a very good job at the protein folding problem. Kind of an interesting result. Okay, so these various crowdsourcing and gamification programs started to capture the attention of Darpa, which is the Defense Agency Research Project. I'm missing something here. Defense Agency Research Project Agency. Anyways, Darpa is the research arm of the Department of Defense. As you can imagine, the Department of Defense is interested in trying to recruit large numbers of people to solve a collective search task in a very short period of time if some unexpected event happens. How could you quickly recruit a large number of people and ask them, if you see an X, Y, and Z, please report it to the authorities as soon as possible? DARPA was interested in developing technologies that would help people spontaneously coordinate their action to solve this problem. So in order to test this idea, DARPA created the DARPA Network Challenge, which became nicknamed the Red Balloon Challenge. The Red Balloon Challenge works as follows. DARPA announced that they would give $40,000 to the team that was able to locate 10 8-foot red balloons that were going to be placed at 10 random locations in the continental United States. And the team that reported the GPS coordinates of those 10 balloons first would win the $40,000. So DARPA announced this challenge. They announced the date that they were going to place the balloons. DARPA prepared to leave the balloons up for about a week and to accept submissions up to 2 weeks after the competition. On the day of the competition, in 9 hours, a team from MIT successfully reported the GPS coordinates of all 10 red balloons. Much, much earlier than anyone was expected would be possible. So some of you may know about the Red Balloon Challenge. You might know about the MIT team and how they solved it. If you do, don't type it into chat yet for those who haven't seen the answer. I want you to take a moment and think about how you would solve this problem. let's imagine you read about this challenge on the internet, and you get together 2 of your friends who are good coders, and the 3 of you decide you're going to go about trying to find these 10 red balloons. How would you go about doing it? What set of technologies would you pull together? What code might you write? How might you recruit other people to your cause to help you find and report the positions of these balloons? Remember that this was carried out in 2009. At this point, social media existed, but you couldn't really go to Twitter and type in big red balloon and instantly find people reporting, hey, in my backyard or in the park near my house, there's this weird large red balloon. Today, that would probably be sufficient to find all 10 balloons in 9 hours. That wasn't possible back in 2009. I want you to think about how you might go about solving this, and if you start to have some ideas, no matter how rough and unpolished they are, feel free to go ahead and type them into chat. Just remember, if you know what the actual answer is, how the MIT team solved this problem, do not type that into chat. Okay, go for it. Let's see what you come up with. Okay, you can go ahead and continue to type in your ideas if you have them. I'll start with Alex's comment here. Searching through online news sources around the same time they were put up to see if they got any coverage. That would probably work today, but in 2009, there weren't as many people posting to social media as there are now. That wasn't the answer. It wasn't sufficient to find it. Not all the balloons were reported by someone publicly on the internet. Willems at the top says, make a web page offering $39,999 to someone else to find them for you. So Willem's solution is to incentivize with money someone else to find the balloon. What is the probability of any one person finding all 10 balloons? It's pretty much close to 0. So if I saw Willem's advertisement and I understood what he was asking, that he'd give me $39,000 if I found all 10 balloons, and if I understood the problem, I would realize the chance that I'm going to find all 10 balloons is close to 0. So it's not worth my time, even though $39,999 would be a nice thing to get. So incentivizing people to find the balloons is unlikely to work. Willem says you could also get an extra $1 by giving them to Darpa instead of me. Okay, so Henry says maybe $50 for the first person to find a single balloon. Okay, so what's my chance if I see Henry's advertisement? If I say, oh, I could get $50 if I find one of these balloons? Again, if I understand the problem, what's the chance that I'm even going to find one balloon? assuming I live in the continental United States. Still pretty slim. So it doesn't make sense to incentivize people financially to find all 10 balloons. It probably also doesn't make sense to incentivize them to even find one balloon. What should we incentivize people to do? What would be easier for them to do where they would still get a financial reward? You can tell someone, I'll give you X dollars if you find, the balloons are 8 feet in width. They put them in parks and I think mostly parks. Yeah. You can financially incentivize people not to find balloons, but to spread the word. So as Henry says here, spread the word to more people. So Henry might offer a financial reward if I see Henry's advertisement and I advertise and I pass along the advertisement. So work together with people physically near the other balloons, okay, if you know where the other balloons are. We're out of time for today. Do not look at the next slide in this slide sequence. If you're interested in this problem, see if you can actually sort of write down a simple algorithm that you might deploy on a social network to get this to work. I will see you next Tuesday. Remember that you have Deliverable 7 due this coming Monday evening. You have a quiz due tonight, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.